In the capital's darkness, an old sorcerer thought he had found refuge. But the Empire's most dangerous assassin had already marked two names, Yuuki Kagurazaka and Gadora. Before we step into the ambush, if this story has you watching the shadows a little closer, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe. It helps keep these long-form AI anime episodes moving without slowing the story down. Now, let's return to the moment Gadora asked Tempest for asylum. An elderly man was prostrated in front of me. Behind him, the three adventurers I had been watching from the dungeon control room were doing the same thing. The old man's name was Gadora. He was the master sorcerer who had gone through Diablo and Raisin to ask for an audience with me. His robe was plain compared with the sort of gaudy outfit I had expected, but it was obviously expensive, and his eyes were sharp enough to make the word elderly feel a little suspicious. Shinji, the one I had first known as Shinji, was actually Shinji Tanemura. The other two were Marc and Zhen. All three had been assigned to Gadora as apprentices for their current investigation, though they normally worked under Yuuki. They had already explained that part. Then Gadora finished speaking and flattened himself on the floor, with Shinji's group copying him exactly. There was no way a conversation was going to work like this. I told them, "Yeah, that is about what I figured, but we cannot really talk while you are bowing like that, okay? Let's move somewhere else." Shion nodded, sounding strangely grumpy as she ordered them to lift their heads. This was exactly why I hated royal audiences. I always felt like I was one wrong gesture away from ruining the atmosphere. Honestly, I would rather skip the whole formal thing whenever possible. Gadora and the others answered with an exaggerated shout which only made me dread the rest of the meeting more. So we moved into a plainer reception room. I liked that room better. The formal chamber had furniture so expensive that even setting down a teacup made me nervous. One spill on that carpet and I would feel guilty for the rest of the day. Deep down, I was still a commoner. Shinji's group seemed to relax a bit too. I asked them, which would you rather have, tea or coffee? Shinji hesitated, then asked for coffee. Gadora almost exploded. Shinji! It took a moment to calm him down. When I asked Gadora what he wanted, he swallowed his panic and decided to have the same thing. Marc and Zhen nodded along, so I called to Shuna for 4 American blends. American? Gadora yelped. I asked if he wanted something stronger, maybe dark roast or something in Tempest style, but that was not what had startled him. After a few awkward seconds, Gadora looked at me with the face of a man who had just realized he had missed something obvious. Sir Rimuru, would you happen to be an Otherworlder? I answered. Yeah? That was the question? If that surprised him, he really had not done enough homework. Shinji, Marc, and Zhen already knew, which meant they had either forgotten to tell him or had decided it was not worth mentioning. Either way, there was no point dragging it out. Shuna set coffee, milk, and sugar on the table. Shinji's group watched with wonder, and Shinji took one sip and praised the coffee. Gadora shot him a look so bitter that I decided to pretend I had not seen it. Then Gadora began with a bombshell. He told me he was a veteran Reincarnate too. Not an ordinary old man who had lived a long time, but a sorcerer who had reincarnated himself again and again while pursuing the secrets of magic. In each life, he slipped into royal libraries, gathered hidden knowledge, and built himself into one of the greatest spellcasters around. During that long research, he met Adalmann, and the two became close friends. Gadora's grudge against the Western Holy Church came from that friendship. When Adalmann was killed, or so Gadora believed, he swore revenge. He went alone into the Empire, built his reputation there, and used centuries of influence to steer Imperial ambition westward. He had even fought Veldora before. Gadora admitted that finishing his reincarnation ritual before that challenge had probably saved him. He had wanted to witness the ultimate evil, the worst calamity nature could create. He said this right in front of Veldora, who kept sending me smug little side glances. I wished he would stop. Yes, very impressive. That did not mean I needed to praise him every time someone brought it up. Gadora said the Empire might have managed a tactical victory against Veldora under the right conditions, but the commanders wanted something far more ridiculous. They wanted to bring Veldora under Imperial control. Gadora had warned them over and over that it was impossible, but they overestimated themselves and refused to listen. On the surface, that made Gadora sound almost reasonable. He did not want soldiers wasted on a hopeless dragon campaign. His real interest had been revenge against Luminism and the West. But there was another side to it. Gadora was also the one who had fanned the Empire's appetite for conquest. I cut through the old history and brought him back to the current problem. So basically, the Empire is trying to start this war because of you? I asked. He tried to dodge. He said that was only part of it. Then he rushed into excuses, claiming the Empire had always been hungry for domination. If he had not given that hunger a direction, it would have burned everywhere at once. All he had done, he insisted, was turn their eyes toward the West, where his own goals happened to line up with theirs. What a convenient way to put it, because now we were mixed up in it for no reason. Gadora also claimed he had opposed invading the forest of Jura. It was Veldora's domain after all, and he had no wish to repeat the Empire's earlier mistakes. Instead, he had suggested diplomatic maneuvering around Dwargen, perhaps winning King Gazel's cooperation for a western march. That got my attention. I had mostly ruled out a Dwargen route, but maybe we could not ignore it after all. Gadora clarified that he did not mean the Empire had a concrete plan to conquer the Dwarven Kingdom. His suggestion had been an alliance, not an attack. His only true grudge, he said, was still against the Western Holy Church. But the grudge had already lost its center. Adalmann was alive, or at least alive enough, and once Gadora learned that, his reason for staying with the Empire started to collapse. He was friendly with the Emperor, but even he could not simply order the military to withdraw. So he had been arguing against the war in meetings instead. It was a little too convenient for my liking. Still, if he could help us avoid war, I could bite my tongue. Benimaru and the others were listening from the next room, holding their own strategy meeting while I kept Gadora comfortable enough to talk. I asked whether King Gazel had refused him. Gadora said of course he had. Some Imperial commanders had floated assassination, and Gadora proudly said he opposed that, arguing that if they were willing to go that far, they might as well launch a full assault. That was not the sort of thing he needed to sound proud of. I kept extracting information anyway, the Empire's military structure, the thinking of its commanders, even the shocking fact that Yuuki was planning a coup. By the end, I had most of what Gadora could give me. Then, once he seemed comfortable, Gadora admitted something even more shameless. He had no real sense of duty to the Empire. They had broken up the division he built and taken his men away. Shinji, Marc, and Zhen were personal apprentices he could still call on, but if Adalmann was safe, then Gadora had no attachment left to the Empire at all. He was selfish, egocentric, and frank enough to say it to my face. I was not going to say this out loud, but I almost respected it. Then, immediately after announcing his lack of loyalty, he asked to join my side. I could practically hear Benimaru losing his temper in the next room. Still, I accepted Gadora as a probationary guest advisor. If he wanted a place in Tempest, he could earn it. I did not expect him to become loyal overnight, but his knowledge was too useful to throw away. For now, he could meet Adalmann and use transport to reach floor 70. He might even help Ramirez later. Before that, though, I had a job for him back in the Empire. Shinji, Marc, and Zhen would remain in Tempest. They asked for time to rest and decide what they wanted to do, and I had no reason to refuse. They pledged loyalty to me easily enough, probably because they knew exile was the alternative, but they also asked not to be used against Yuuki. I agreed. Our relationship with Yuuki's side is complicated, I told them. A truce is probably the easiest way to describe it. He has irritated me enough that I would love to get him back someday, but I cannot quite bring myself to hate him either. Yuuki was still Shizu's student. Whenever I remembered how happy Shizu looked when she spoke about him, I found myself cutting him a little slack. Maybe I was too soft. Maybe it was because he was a fellow Japanese Otherworlder. Either way, there would be no more second chances. But for now, I could leave the past on ice. Trusting him was another matter. Trusting that guy now would be a death wish. So I warned Shinji's group not to trust Yuuki too much either. Gadora nodded at that. He clearly had thoughts of his own about Yuuki. They had worked together before, and maybe that meant Gadora could serve as a go-between. If he did not blindly trust Yuuki, that was at least one point in his favor. Later, I reunited Gadora with Adalmann. The two old friends reminisced warmly, and Adalmann agreed to take him in. That settled where Gadora would stay once he returned. But first, I ordered him back to the Empire. His first job was simple: argue against the war. Gadora said he was used to working behind the scenes. I believed him, but stopping a whole nation by himself was nearly impossible, so I gave him a plan B. If he could not stop the war, he was to point the Empire toward the Labyrinth. Gadora understood after I explained it. In the Labyrinth, we could take losses without actually losing anyone. If the Imperial Army came there, we could chip away at their strength and morale. And if Yuuki used the opportunity to cause trouble at home, the Empire might not be able to keep its war going. I gave Gadora Labyrinth equipment and 3 resurrection bracelets. They would work as proof and bait. No commander wanted an enemy stronghold at his back. And if treasure, rare weapons, and a deathless training ground dangled in front of greedy eyes, the Empire would have a hard time ignoring it. Gadora smiled. He knew a few commanders greedy enough to bite. So that was the plan. Stop the war if possible. If not, drag the army into the dungeon. The rest was up to Gadora, and with that, I granted asylum to Gadora and his 3 apprentices. Unexpected allies, maybe. Useful ones, definitely. The incident ended there, but the Empire had already begun to move. In the Imperial capital, there was a man who lived in the shadows. His name was Tatsuya Kondo, an Otherworlder who knew the Empire's underground better than anyone. If the capital had a darkness of its own, Kondo was the shape it took. He kept his black hair short and neat, and at first glance he looked like a calm young man in his early 20s. But his eyes were too cold for that impression to last. They were calculating eyes, sharp enough to cut through whatever they watched. First Lieutenant Kondo was not the age he appeared to be. Otherworlders were not rare in the Empire. The state collected and protected them, gathering them from across the world. Kondo had arrived more than 70 years earlier, but his case had been unusual even among theirs. In his original world, he had served his country in a special attack force on a mission that expected him to die. Kondo did not try to justify it. Looking back, he simply thought there had been nothing else he could do. What mattered was that he remembered the men who served and died with him. To keep that memory alive, he still called himself First Lieutenant. He had gone to his death and instead awakened in another world, surrounded by heat, light, and impossible survival. The Emperor saved him. Kondo had appeared in a private garden where only the Emperor and a handful of close associates were allowed. The Emperor happened to be there. Kondo heard the Emperor call it fate. Then he lost consciousness. When he woke, his body was whole. He had abandoned his life once. The life returned to him became a debt, and Kondo offered everything he gained in this world to the Emperor. His powers, his loyalty, his service. That had never changed. He did not stand on the public stage. He did not age. He remained in the intelligence office buried in the Empire's shadow, feared by every division commander as the head of the Imperial Information Bureau. And now the IIB had a report for him. Gadora had sent a team led by Shinji to conquer the dungeon. Kondo acknowledged the report quietly and dismissed the messenger. He was not a man who explained his thoughts out loud. The report contained a wider picture. Yuuki Kagurazaka, former Grandmaster of the Free Guild, had brought large numbers of Otherworlders under his influence. The Empire knew he claimed to rescue them, but the IIB had already decided that story was false. Yuuki had grown close to the Razo family, and the West's forbidden summoning work explained why so many battle-capable Otherworlders existed there in the first place. There was also the danger of locking curses, oaths forced onto summoned people so they could never betray their masters. Those people had been placed in military and political positions across the continent. Kondo saw the pattern clearly. Based on Yuki's actions since entering the Empire, the IIB judged that he was highly likely to attempt a coup. Yuuki had already inserted allies into army divisions. Some had even entered the Imperial Guardians, the force meant to protect the Emperor himself. That could not be allowed. Kondo decided that Yuuki Kagurazaka was someone who deserved elimination, but the timing was not right. Gadora was also connected to Yuuki, and his importance to the Empire was too great to ignore. Kondo doubted Gadora would turn traitor on a whim, but Gadora had always worked with the Empire because their goals aligned with his own. If those goals changed, he could become just as dangerous. Yuuki looked like a boy, but his actions belonged to someone experienced. Gadora looked old, but he was a living monster, a sorcerer who had survived for more than 1,000 years. Neither could be judged by appearance. For the moment, Kondo would gather information, investigate Yuuki's Otherworlders, and check for locking curses. But if Yuuki or Gadora made one suspicious move, they would not receive a public trial. In the darkness of the Empire, Kondo whispered that both of them were already in his hands. Elsewhere in the capital, a one-eyed man sat behind an ornate desk. His name was Caligulio, commander of the Armored Division, the strongest military force in the Empire. On the desk in front of him lay several magic crystals. They were pure, high-quality sources of magical energy, the kind that could be refined into magistones with technology Yuuki had provided. The research report said crystals of this grade were valuable enough to change the Empire's energy calculations. Caligulio picked one up, studied it, and cursed Gadora for hiding such a money-making opportunity. The crystals were too consistent to have come from random monster drops. They looked like they came from a steady hunting ground, and Caligulio's people had traced that ground to the dungeon in the domain of the demon lord Rimuru. That was enough to irritate him. Gadora had been giving too much attention to Yuuki, and now it seemed the old man had tried to keep a prize for himself. The crystals were not the only bait. A high-ranking noble had sold Caligulio a set of 3 magisteel swords that Gadora had brought back. They were beautiful pieces, better than anything circulating in the Empire. One decorated Caligulio's office, and one was already with the technical department. Each had an empty slot in the hilt, supposedly tied to some mysterious power. The noble had played coy, of course. Upper nobles never offered information out of kindness. Caligulio understood the game. They had placed him and Yuuki on opposite sides of a scale, then waited to see who paid better. That did not matter. If Caligulio captured the Labyrinth, the nobles could have their cut. The prize was still worth it. The dungeon promised magic crystals, rare weapons, and perhaps a treasure even more useful than either, the resurrection bracelet Gadora had brought back. If the rumors were true, the Labyrinth could become a military training ground where soldiers fought without permanent death. A few days later, Caligulio's chief technician confirmed that the slotted sword was not just a sword. The slot absorbed energy and turned the weapon into a magic launcher. With the right supply inserted, even a person insensitive to magic could cast spells through it. That idea fascinated Caligulio. It also told him something about Rimuru. The demon lord was not merely selling weapons. He was likely distributing test models through adventurers and letting the crowd gather combat data. A laboratory where no one truly died was the perfect place to run those tests. Caligulio saw the danger. If Tempest was allowed years to refine that research, the Empire would lose its advantage. If the Armored Division seized the Labyrinth first, however, it would gain a stable energy source, experimental weapons, training value, and prestige. His technician wondered whether Caligulio was prepared to fight a demon lord for it. Caligulio was. The forest of Jura sat in the middle of the Empire's western route, and the Labyrinth was too important to ignore. Someone had to capture it. He also believed Gadora had become obsolete. The age of pure magic was over. Science and magic together were the new wind blowing through the Empire, and Caligulio was certain he understood that future better than the old sorcerer did. Rimuru alone did not worry him. Veldora was the true prize, and Caligulio believed he had the weapon to force the Storm Dragon into submission. Once Veldora was tamed, the Demon Lord Slime would be easy, and the Armored Division would prove itself the greatest force in the Empire. So Caligulio prepared his proposal for the next Imperial Council. The council gathered in a chamber heavy with tension. Military officers and civil officials sat in precise rows. Imperial guardians stood at attention. Ministers and nobles bowed their heads. Nearly 200 people waited in silence. Behind the blind was United Emperor Ludora Nam Ul Nazca, ruler of the Nazca Namrium Ulmeria United Eastern Empire. He did not speak directly to the masses. His presence alone was enough to press the room into stillness. This council would decide how the Empire moved toward war. The Emperor's will was not in question. War was coming. The debate was how to wage it, what pretext to use, and how to deal with the greatest obstacle between the Empire and the West, the forest of Jura, where Veldora had revived and where the demon lord Rimuru now ruled. Gadora spoke against the campaign without fear. Caligulio immediately mocked him for cowardice. This was an old argument between them, the cautious sorcerer and the war-hungry commander. Gadora argued that the Empire could not ignore Veldora's return. The Storm Dragon was now partnered with Rimuru, and provoking a Demon Lord's domain was foolish when diplomacy or a pact could avoid it. Caligulio countered that giving up the forest route meant abandoning the Empire's dearest wish. Gradim, the Beast King and commander of the Magical Beast Division, joined in with a harsher argument. Why court the Dwarven King when the Empire could crush whoever stood in its way? Slaying a Demon Lord would inspire the people far more than negotiating with Dwargen. Gradim's presence filled the room. He was one of the Empire's strongest fighters, proud, instinctive, and not especially interested in restraint. He treated Gadora's caution as weakness. Gadora tried to explain that he meant an alliance with King Gazel, not an invasion of Dwargen, but Gradim shouted him down. Caligulio piled on, laughing that Gadora's magic knowledge was valuable but that the old era of sorcerers had ended. In truth, it had. The magic division Gadora once led had been dismantled. Its best minds went to technical departments and the rest were scattered elsewhere. Spell guns let ordinary soldiers fire magic through magistones. Magic sabers brought the same principle to close combat. Individual talent mattered less than equipment, production, and doctrine. The Council's scorn was real, but Gadora's anger was partly an act. He had already capitulated to Rimuru. He was trying to steer the Empire away from disaster, but if they refused to listen, he would not grieve long for the fools who ignored him. He had seen Tempest, he had seen Rimuru. He knew victory against that nation was far from certain. He still owed the Emperor a debt. He still meant to protect Veldora if Yuuki's coup began. But if the war faction would not stop, then he would at least fulfill Rimuru's request and make the dungeon sound irresistible. With that thought, Gadora looked toward Yuuki, who had not yet spoken. Caligulio mistook Gadora's silence for defeat. The Empire's 3 modern divisions had become the backbone of Imperial confidence. Caligulio's armored division was the largest, built from Otherworlder science and magical engineering. It could field about 1 million soldiers on short notice, including the restructured armor corps, 3,000 magitanks, and 400 airships. Gradim's Magical Beast Division was smaller, about 30,000 champions and their A-class mounts, but each fighter was elite. Yuuki's Composite Division looked disorderly from the outside, but it was full of irregulars and otherworlders whose abilities could not be reproduced. Some were staff or intelligence officers, but the Corps was a private force loyal to Yuuki. Altogether, the Empire could likely move more than 1 million trained soldiers once the edict came. Against the Western nation's scattered forces, the numbers were overwhelming. At the center of that confidence stood Caligulio. He planned to deploy all his tanks and airships, and he felt almost omnipotent. So when Yuuki finally spoke, Caligulio noticed. Yuuki agreed that Gadora was too cautious. He said the Empire could handle even the Storm Dragon now. The words sounded supportive, but Caligulio immediately suspected the real aim. Yuuki wanted the dungeon for himself. Caligulio smiled politely and let him continue. Yuuki raised the problem of scouting the forest of Jura. To pass through Rimuru's domain, the Empire needed current intelligence. Then he introduced a startling report. Rimuru's city could apparently be moved completely into the Labyrinth, leaving only a great gate on the surface. The room stirred. If that was true, the dungeon could not be ignored. An enemy city hidden underground might strike supply lines after the army passed. Yuuki then supplied credibility. Gadora himself had investigated the dungeon. He had learned that it reached 100 floors, and that rumor placed Veldora on the deepest level. His team had suffered losses around the 60th floor, and not even Masayuki the hero had reportedly passed that point. Yuki's tone became serious. No matter what route the Empire chose, he said, the dungeon required further investigation. The nobles began murmuring that the Composite Division might be suited for that task. Caligulio saw the maneuver and hated it. Yuuki was turning both bribed nobles and neutral listeners toward his preferred conclusion. So Caligulio rose and addressed the Emperor behind the blind directly, an act so bold that the room shuddered. He declared that he was not afraid of Veldora, Rimuru, or the West. He asked for the order to begin the conquest and promised to stake body and soul on victory. The chamber erupted. some officials objected to the breach of protocol. Gradim demanded deployment for the Magical Beast Division. Yuuki, forced to move, asked that the Composite Division be allowed to investigate the dungeon. All three commanders bowed for orders. The Emperor did not answer. Someone else stood behind the blind. She was the Imperial Marshal, Supreme Commander of the Empire's forces. Even her name was not public. She was said to remain at the Emperor's side as his protector. And in the Empire, the title of Marshal meant the strongest. With a sweet smile and a voice that cut through the room, she told the idiots to be quiet in Veldora's presence. Everyone dropped to the floor. The Marshal asked whether Veldora's interference in the past had shaken the Empire. The answer thundered back, no. The Emperor's divine protection had preserved them. Her dominance filled the hall. No one could resist it. Then she praised Yuuki's achievements and called him soft. The Empire had done nothing since Veldora's revival, she said, not because it was preparing, but because cowards had dressed their fear in excuses. Gadora could not deny it. He had argued against fighting Veldora rather than debating how to win. But something about the Marshal unsettled him. He had seen her face before, one of the few people who had. Beneath her detached tone, he sensed impatience, panic even. And that made no sense. She turned her cold attention on him and asked whether he was interfering with the Empire's dominance. Gadora's spine froze. For the first time, he wondered what the Empire truly was, and what the Emperor truly was. Then the Marshal turned to Caligulio and asked about his strategy. Caligulio's earlier confidence faltered under her pressure. Still, he described the anti-Veldora plan that had made him so certain of victory. The Empire had developed a magic canceller, a beam that disturbed magicules themselves. Against a sorcerer, it could jam spells. Against a monster, it could scramble the magicule-based body and hinder movement. Against Veldora, a being of enormous magicule energy, Caligulio believed it would be decisive. The plan was to lure Veldora into range of a magic canceller in the forest, then hit him again from an airship overhead. Once he was weakened, 2,000 magi-tanks would fire a simultaneous magi-cannon volley. Even a true dragon, Caligulio believed, would not survive unharmed. But facing the Marshal, he realized his on-site investigation was thin. His tongue grew heavy. The Marshal dismissed the plan as worthless. More than that, she said the entire concept was wrong. The Marshal's point was simple: why destroy Veldora at all? The Empire had not waited for his revival so it could kill him. It had waited so it could defeat him in his complete state and rule over him. Only then would its victory be complete. The room fell under a terror that felt like a hand around every heart. Gadora was shaken too. He had spent so long explaining that mentally dominating Veldora was impossible, but from the Marshal's mouth, the idea sounded almost possible. That was what terrified him. He looked toward the silhouette behind the silk blind. It was graceful, but to Gadora it seemed like an unimaginable monster, almost like a true dragon in human form. He wiped the thought away as quickly as he could. Then Yuuki spoke into the frozen air. The Marshal allowed him to proceed. Yuuki proposed that the divisions stop fighting over glory and move in a coordinated way. The armored division would advance from the forest of Jura side. Rimuru's forces were gathering near the Great Ameld River, using a lodging town as their base. The Empire would move between the Kanat Mountains and the forest, reach the main entrance of the Dwarven Kingdom, follow the Ameld south, and bring hostilities to the lodging town. Caligulio objected. Moving that way risked drawing Dwargen into the war, and if the dwarves reinforced Rimuru, the Empire could be squeezed between river and forest. Yuuki smiled. He said they were not really aiming for the lodging town. They were aiming for Dwargen. If King Gazel refused the Empire's offer, then the dwarves could hardly be called friendly. The council stirred in alarm. Dwargen was a fortress nation. Even if the Empire could win, the casualties might be terrible. Yuuki pointed to the tanks. Dwargen was famous for magical defense, but if the Empire could overcome that, the rest became possible. A strike toward the central gate could look like a move on Rimuru's base while also blocking dwarven reinforcements. Caligulio understood the value of the idea. He also saw the deception. If magic cannon fire destroyed the central gate, the city would suffer enormous damage, and the fortress might not be usable during the war. Still, the plan would set a battlefield on the Empire's term. Then Yuuki returned to the dungeon. His composite division was suited for individual action, he said. If Veldora truly guarded the 100th floor, someone needed to check that story. Caligulio had expected this. He blocked it at once. If the composite division ignored the lodging town and went straight to the monster capital, it would open the Empire to a pincer attack. Better, he said, to let the armored division push through the forest all the way to the dungeon and confirm whether the city really disappeared. Tactically, they had to assume Rimuru's main force would be waiting there. Yuki's expression cracked for just a moment and Caligulio enjoyed it. Then the Marshal approved Caligulio's role. The armored division would handle the Demon Lord front, but that was not all. She assigned the composite division to pressure Dwargen's east gate while still handling capital defense. Yuuki considered objecting, but the order was final. Gradim, afraid his magical beast division would be left with no glory, begged for a role. The Marshal told him to take his entire division north. Gradim thought she meant crossing the Kanat Mountains and nearly choked on the problem. Instead, she told him to go by sea and attack Anglecia. Barmanus was still rebuilding. Once Dwargen fell, it could be crushed later. Gradim protested that he had no large transport vessels. The Marshal turned to Caligulio. Caligulio had no choice but to offer the airships. He still needed 100 as a deciding factor against Veldora, but the remaining 300 could transport Gradim's forces and support staff. They would not be handed over as combat assets, but they could carry the magical beast division to the northern route. Gradim thought it through. He would lose the chance to face Rimuru or Veldora directly, but he would gain a surprise strike against the west. He could fight the Crusaders, challenge the champions of Lubelius, and trample a battlefield that was not ready for him. He accepted. The council erupted with confidence. Victory to the Empire. Glory to the Emperor. Caligulio added that a sea route would avoid the Dragon's Nest and keep them safe from the biggest threats. He had studied the option before, never expecting it to become central, and now he saw how useful it could be. With the West's attention fixed on Jura, a northern strike would leave it confused and leaderless. The Marshal asked if there were objections. Caligulio agreed to prepare the strategy with Gradim. Yuuki, still unable to resist his usual sass, said he would show the Dwarven King the Empire's best show of force at the East Gate. The room gave him strange looks, wondering whether he was fearless or just a fool. The Marshal paid no mind. She ordered preparations to begin at once. Without Emperor Ledora saying a single word, the Empire committed itself to a simultaneous three-pronged invasion. Caligulio's armored division would strike toward Jura, Rimuru, Veldora, and the dungeon. Yuki's composite division would pressure Dwargen while guarding the capital. Gradim's magical beast division would move by airship and sea toward Anglecia. The Imperial Edict came later that day. After the council, Yuuki let out a quiet breath. The Marshal had never taken such an active role before, and her intervention forced him to adjust his coup plan. The armored division, his biggest obstacle, would still be moving away toward the forest of Jura. That part worked. The problem was the magical beast division. Yuuki had Vega hidden there, and his original plan had used Vega as both diversion and scapegoat. If Gradim's division left by the northern route, that piece of the plan had to change. Yuuki decided the outline could still survive. Caligulio had taken the bait, exactly as expected. He was loyal and strategic, not the sort of fighter who chased adventure for its own sake, but greed could move him. Tempest had money, new technology, and dungeon treasure. If Caligulio believed he had discovered that prize himself, he would take losses to claim it. Gadora's items and intelligence had made that possible. Still, Gadora looked troubled. Yuuki asked why. Gadora said the Marshal seemed panicked. Yuuki had not seen it, but he admitted she was a monster. He could usually gauge whether he could beat someone, especially now that his ultimate skill let him read hidden abilities. With the Marshal, he could not get a proper measure at all. Gadora explained that every generation of Emperor Ludora's family had a Marshal beside the throne, a protector strong enough to stand at the Empire's peak. Yet there was no record of a Marshal speaking out on military policy like that, so why now? The danger fit too well with something Yuuki had already suspected. Guy Crimson, strongest of the Demon Lords, had some history with the Empire. Someone like Guy did not ignore a military superpower for no reason. If he left the Empire alone, perhaps there was someone inside it worth being wary of. Yuuki smiled despite himself. A war large enough to shake the world might reveal some of those hidden answers. Gadora sighed and moved on to future plans. He had tried to stop the war and failed. That failure was partly his own fault and Yuuki did not let him forget it. Gadora admitted he had fanned the flames too long to expect the council to turn aside now. But he had met Rimuru, he had seen Tempest's strength. Adalmann, who Gadora had considered close to his own level, was merely a guardian on the dungeon's lower floors, and there were still more people above him. Rimuru himself was gentle but impossible to see through. Only a fool among fools would pick a fight with that nation. Gadora believed the Empire would be trounced. At least he had fulfilled Rimuru's request. He had turned the Empire's attention toward the dungeon. Now he needed to decide what he would do with himself. He told Yuuki that after one final audience with His Majesty, he intended to go to the land of monsters. Yuuki called that a frank way to announce betrayal. Gadora denied it. He simply lived as he pleased. He also told Yuuki that this was not goodbye. If Yuuki ever ran into trouble, he could rely on him. Gadora was selfish, but he was kind to those he considered close. Yuuki liked that about him. The old man's freedom, his complete honesty about himself had a strange shine to it. Gadora warned that he would be a newcomer in Tempest and would need to earn trust, so Yuuki should not expect to exploit him immediately. Yuuki laughed that such things were better left unsaid. Gadora replied that someone as brash as Yuuki needed things spelled out. He also asked after the jesters. Yuuki said they were scheming somewhere, but he could not say where because Rimuru might find out if he did. Gadora laughed and told him not to answer, then asked that the jesters be told they could count on him if they needed help. After a little more laughter, the two shook hands. Gadora rose to leave. Whatever coup or escapade Yuuki planned next, he said he looked forward to seeing it. Then his tone sharpened. Yuuki already knew the warning. If he committed regicide, Gadora would never forgive him. So long as Yuuki understood that, Gadora said farewell. And so they parted. Gadora's request for a meeting with the Emperor was accepted. As he waited, he considered warning Ludora one more time. He did not know whether the Emperor would heed him, but even now he wished to offer one final counsel to the man to whom he owed his life and position. A guide announced that His Majesty awaited. A veiled attendant led Gadora down a corridor toward a polished atrium. From there, he could see the light crimson blossoms of the all-season cherry tree, petals that never fell from their branches. They were said to symbolize the Empire's eternal existence. Gadora admired them, then thought of the Japanese Otherworlders who had seen the tree differently. They had spoken of wabi-sabi, the beauty of things that could not last. To them, a cherry blossom's beauty came from its fleeting nature. People saw the same thing in different ways. Then Gadora addressed the man beneath the tree. "Wouldn't you agree, Sir Kondo?" An intense young man appeared from beneath the blossoms. Kondo said he had erased his presence. Gadora admitted that he had not truly noticed him. It was more like foreboding, a faint sense of danger. The attendant had vanished. Gadora drew his staff. Kondo told him he could not allow the audience with His Majesty. Gadora asked why. Kondo said he had no intention of telling him, and that knowing would gain Gadora nothing. In Kondo's hand was a dull metallic shape, a classic Nambu pistol, the first semi-automatic weapon produced in what was then the Empire of Japan. Gadora asked whether Kondo meant to kill him. Kondo did not react. Gadora began to say his name, but pain struck through his chest. He had been watching Kondo's trigger finger. He knew what guns were. He had listened for a gunshot, and none came. The pain had come from behind. As his body fell, Gadora understood. It was not a bullet. It was a knife in his back. Kondo had done nothing. Someone else had struck. Kondo asked the unseen attacker why. The answer came from a voice Gadora knew. "Because this man is dangerous. If we allow traitors in our midst, it will hinder the next emperor's reign." Gadora could hardly believe the voice. Perhaps it was only a hallucination before death. Kondo said Gadora was a close friend of His Majesty. But Gadora's consciousness was already slipping. Soon he could no longer hear Kondo at all. Death was certain now. They had even used poison, taking every precaution. Perhaps this was punishment for trying to betray Emperor Ludora. But even as the never-withering cherry blossoms danced around him, Gadora made one final bet. He triggered the spell he had prepared in advance. Then everything went black.
Route confirmed. The next episode and full playlist are ready.
Then don't stop here. Keep watching in story order and subscribe before the next part drops.